The cold stone walls of Chopa's castle still seemed to carry faint echoes, whispers of screams long silenced but never truly gone. On bitter winter nights, when the wind howls through the empty corridors, those walls feel alive with the ghosts of the past. If you stand near the ruined tower where she was sealed away, walled in alive, you might almost catch the scent, a sharp metallic temps of iron, mingled with the sickly sweetness of decay that once filled these shadowed halls. It is the year 1610. Deep within this fortress, a noblewoman sits immersed not in water, but in a dark, thick liquid that steams against the chill of the dungeon air. Her pale skin, now wrinkled with the slow crawl of age, despite her desperate resistance to time, gleams crimson in the flickering candlelight. She runs her hands through this eerie bath, clinging to the belief that this ritual might restore what has been lost: her youth, her beauty, her power. But the girl whose life flows in that sinister pool will never witness another sunrise. She was just 16, a simple servant girl who committed an unforgivable mistake, accidentally tugging the Countess's hair while brushing it. For this error she paid the ultimate price. This is the tale of Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess, a name forever stained with unspeakable cruelty. So brutal were her crimes that even the most seasoned investigators of her day found it difficult to fully document them. Yet, to understand the monster she became, we must first look at the woman behind the legend and the world that shaped her. Before we dive deeper into this dark chapter of history, if you find these hidden truths compelling, consider liking and subscribing, and please share where you're listening from. I find it remarkable that across continents and centuries, we're connected by a shared curiosity about the past. Elizabeth Bathory was born in Iwuloling, into one of Hungary's most powerful families, time when power meant everything, and human life, especially that of peasants, was worth very little. The Bathory name commanded fear and respect throughout Eastern Europe. They were famed dragon slayers, vampire hunters, and political players who had shaped the region's fate for generations. Yet beneath this noble lineage lay a twisted Lagusha family tree gnarled by madness and inbreeding. This not only concentrated wealth and power, but also the seeds of mental instability. Her uncle, Stephen, was infamous for violent outbursts and brutal treatment of prisoners. Her aunt Clara was rumored to practice dark arts, teaching young Elizabeth about herbs, potions, and rituals that straddled the thin line between healing and witchcraft. Imagine young Elizabeth wandering the vast corridors of her family estate, elegant child with porcelain skin and dark, piercing eyes that seemed to soak in everything around her. Educated as befitted a noble, she was fluent in 4 languages, well-versed in philosophy, and carried herself with the regal bearing of a born ruler. But behind closed doors, Elizabeth's education was darker. At just 11, she witnessed her first execution. A peasant accused of stealing grain was sentenced to death not with a quick sword blow, but with cruel deliberation. Stripped and bound, he was left to freeze in the castle courtyard, the family watching from warm chambers. Above, Elizabeth pressed her face to the glass, eyes fixed as the man's skin changed color: blue, purple, then black. She didn't look away, even as frostbite claimed his fingers one by one. Years later, she would tell her servants that this moment revealed the true nature of power, not just the ability to give life, but the far more intoxicating power to take it away slowly. Watching the light fade from someone's eyes. When Elizabeth turned 15, she was married to Ferenc Nadasdy, a military commander known as the Black Knight across Hungary. Their marriage was arranged, as all noble unions were. But Ferenc was not a passive partner in Elizabeth's dark inclinations. In fact, he may have been her first true teacher in cruelty. Ferenc spent long stretches at war, battling the Ottoman Empire in brutal campaigns vital to Hungary's survival. When he returned, he brought back more than stories. He carried techniques of interrogation and torture learned from both foes and allies. Their so-called honeymoon was spent in the castle's dungeons, where they experimented on servants who displeased them. Elizabeth learned to wield hot irons, needles, and knives with terrifying skill. She discovered that the human body could endure far more pain than she had imagined, and that the mind could shatter long before the flesh gave way. But most of all, she realized that inflicting such pain gave her a dark thriller rush unmatched by fine wines, luxurious clothes, or even the political games that consumed most nobles. In those early years of marriage, the killings were infrequent and carefully hidden. A servant who broke a vase might be beaten to death, her body quietly buried and her disappearance explained as a voluntary departure. A stable boy who spoke out of turn might be found dead in his stall, supposedly kicked by a horse, though the pattern of wounds told a different story. Ferenc died in 1604, officially from illness, though rumors whispered that even the Black Knight grew uneasy with Elizabeth's growing cruelty. His death left Elizabeth in full control of vast estates, immense wealth, and complete autonomy over her lands and the people within them. She was now 44, beginning to show the first signs of aginja, sight that would soon consume her every thought. For the first time in her life, she answered to no one but herself. Her first kill, driven by blood, was almost accidental. A young servant girl, helping Elizabeth dress, accidentally caught her hair on a brooch and pulled it painfully. Elizabeth turned and slapped her so fiercely that her ring cut deep into the girl's cheek, sending blood splattering across her hand as she wiped the crimson away. Elizabeth noticed something extraordinary. The skin where the blood had touched seemed smoother, younger, as if years had melted from that small patch of flesh. Whether real or imagined mattered little. Elizabeth believed it wholly. That belief would propel her towards savage acts that echoed through history. She began small, testing the ritual. A pinprick here, a minor cut there, always justified by some supposed fault of the victim. She collected the blood in silver bowls, applying it to her face as if it were the most precious cosmetic, studying her reflection for any sign of change. But months passed, and Elizabeth grew convinced that she needed larger quantities of blood, fresh and warm, flowing freely from her. Victims. Injuries were no longer enough, they had to die. Her transformation from cruel noblewoman to serial killer was slow but unstoppable. At first, she killed one servant every few months, always young, always beautiful, convinced their youth and vitality could be transferred to her through their blood. She wove these murders into ritual ceremonies borrowed from the folk magic taught by her aunt. The killings took place in the castle's lower chambers, soundproofed by thick stone and heavy tapestries. Victims were stripped, bound, and slowly tortured to death, their blood collected in basins beneath. Elizabeth believed that terror and pain purified the blood, made it more potent, so she kept her victims alive for days, prolonging their agony before finally allowing them to die. As her obsession deepened, Elizabeth surrounded herself with accomplices, those who shared her dark cravings or were too terrified to refuse. Her inner circle included Dosha Chents, her personal witch and advisor, Janos Ree, a dwarf who served as bodyguard and executioner, Ilona Yor, a servant who helped procure victims, and Katalin Birchie, a washerwoman who disposed of the bodies. Together, they built a horrifying system of murder. Victims were chosen from among the castle's servants, or lured from nearby villages with false promises of work. Always young, always female, always chosen for their beauty and health. Methods varied by Elizabeth's mood or the victim's supposed crimes. Some were beaten to death with clubs, others burned with red-hot irons, or had needles driven under their fingernails. Many were cut in precise patterns to collect the maximum amount of blood. Elizabeth's favorite method was to suspend victims by their wrists from the ceiling, then cut them, slowly letting their blood drain into the bath below. The castle became a charnel house. Bodies were buried on the grounds, thrown into the river, fed to dogs, or left in the forest to be devoured by wild animals. The stench of death hung in the fortress's lower levels, masked by burning incense and herbs, but never fully erased. Remarkably, this slaughter went on for nearly 6 years without official intervention. The disappearance of servant girls was hardly unusual in a society where the poor had no protections and fewer defenders. Authorities, if they noticed at all, were either bribed to look away or assumed the girls had fled to seek fortune elsewhere. By 1609, Elizabeth Bathory was 50. Despite her grotesque rituals, time marched on relentlessly, etching wrinkles and age spots across her once celebrated beauty. Her obsession with youth consumed her entirely, driving her to ever more extreme acts. The killings, once monthly, now happened weekly or more. She became convinced that the blood of peasants was losing its power, too weak, too common. Her victims shifted to young noblewomen, hoping their blood carried greater strength. The delicate balance of managing a noble household was far more complicated than dealing with peasant servants. These young noblewomen, unlike the peasants, came from families that cared deeply for them, families who would ask questions, demand answers, and had the political power to make those demands stick. The first noble victim to vanish was a distant cousin of Elizabeth's, a 16-year-old girl named Anna, sent to Chactis Castle to learn court manners and etiquette. Anna's parents received letters that seemed to come from their daughter, reassuring them that she was well and content in her new surroundings. But these letters were cruel fabrications, written by Elizabeth herself to hide the terrible truth that Anna had been tortured over several agonizing days and killed within the castle walls. When Anna failed to return home as promised, her parents traveled to the castle. Desperate for answers, Elizabeth met them with apparent kindness and concern, expressing shock at Anna's disappearance. She suggested the girl might have run off with a young man she had met, and even offered to help find her. But Anna's mother noticed something chilling. Elizabeth wore Anna's favorite necklace, a distinctive family heirloom passed down through generations. The cruel truth could no longer be hidden. Word quickly spread among noble families across the region. Sending their daughters to Chactis Castle was becoming a dangerous gamble. Parents began to refuse Elizabeth's invitations outright, and the few who still sent their girls demanded regular letters and visits, hoping to keep a close watch. The investigation that would ultimately bring Elizabeth's reign of terror to an end began almost by accident. King Matthias II of Hungary had long eyed the enormous Bathory estates, partly to control their wealth and partly to erase the royal debts owed to the family. When reports of missing noblewomen reached the court, the king seized the opportunity. He appointed George Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, and ironically a relative of Elizabeth's late husband, to investigate. Thurzo was a cautious, meticulous man who knew that accusing a noblewoman of such horrific crimes required indisputable proof. He began by interviewing families of the missing girls, recording their stories, and gathering any evidence he could find. The investigation dragged on for months, while Elizabeth continued her dark rituals, seemingly blind to the danger closing. Around her, by late 1610, Thurzo had amassed testimony from dozens of witnesses, servants who had escaped the castle, grieving family members, and local officials who had been bribed into silence. The picture that emerged was so gruesome it defied belief. According to witness accounts, Elizabeth had murdered anywhere from 80 to 650 young women throughout her reign of terror. The true number would never be known, as many victims were peasants whose disappearances went unrecorded. Yet the physical evidence was undeniable: blood-stained torture devices, rooms heavy with the stench of death, and scattered human remains buried beneath the castle grounds. On December 29, 1610, Thurzo arrived at Chactas Castle with a squad of soldiers and a royal warrant for Elizabeth's arrest. What they uncovered would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The raid began at dawn, while thick morning mist still clung to the ancient stone walls and the forests whispered quietly beyond. Thurzo had chosen the hour carefully, early enough to catch those inside off guard, yet late enough to have enough light to document the horrors they would soon face. From the moment they entered the main hall, the soldiers were hit by a suffocating, sickly stench, the unmistakable odor of death so thick it made several men rush outside to vomit. But they pressed onward, following the trail deeper into the castle's bowels. In the lower chambers, they discovered scenes too horrific for words. One room held 2 young women, recently tortured to death, so fresh that their blood was still warm. Another chamber contained the dismembered remains of several victims, their body parts arranged in patterns that suggested a twisted ritual meaning. Yet the most disturbing discovery lay in Elizabeth's private quarters: a large silver tub filled with thick, warm liquid that appeared to be blood. Floating in the bath were chunks of flesh and tangled strands of human hair. Nearby, Elizabeth herself was found, her body smeared with blood that was clearly not her own. Among the evidence seized was Elizabeth's personal diary, written in her own hand. The pages revealed chilling accounts of her beliefs and experiments, describing how she thought blood could restore youth and vitality. Some entries were so disturbing that authorities sealed them away, never releasing them to the public. Investigators also uncovered the bodies of several noblewomen reported missing in recent months. Their corpses bore marks of prolonged torture, and chemical tests suggested they had been kept alive, held in agony for days or even weeks before being left to die. Elizabeth Bathory herself was never put on trial. As a high-ranking noble, she was technically beyond the reach of common justice. King Matthias, wary of setting a precedent that could threaten other noble families, chose instead to confine her under house arrest. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's accomplices, Chance, Janos, Ilona, and Kathleen Birchie, stood trial in early 1611. Their trial shocked all of Europe. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of a systematic campaign of murder so brutal it stunned even the most cynical observers. Witness after witness recounted the horrors they endured or witnessed. Former servants forced to watch their friends tortured to death, peasants discovering body parts strewn in nearby forests, officials admitting to accepting bribes to turn a blind eye. Detailed records, including sketches of torture devices and notes on methods that produced the most blood, painted a grim picture. The castle itself had been designed as a killing ground, with secret chambers equipped with drainage systems to collect blood and soundproof walls to muffle screams. Perhaps most compelling were the confessions of Elizabeth's accomplices. Facing execution, they turned on each other, trying to lessen their own guilt while condemning others. Dosha Chance, Elizabeth's advisor, claimed she was forced to participate, but witnesses said she eagerly suggested new tortures and took part actively. Janos Rhee, the dwarf bodyguard, admitted to killing victims, sometimes even volunteering for the cruelest tasks. After months of trial, the verdict was clear. All four were found guilty and sentenced to death, their executions carried out according to their perceived levels of involvement. Elizabeth, however, remained confined in her castle, still officially under investigation but effectively beyond the law's reach. King Matthias and his council debated her fate for months. Execution was impossible due to her noble rank, but letting her go free was unthinkable in a grim solution. Elizabeth was walled up alive in her own castle. Confined to a few small rooms, she was cut off from the world, fed through a narrow slot in the wall, and left with no hope of escape or contact beyond the guards who watched over her. This cruel sentence was carried out in late 1611. She was confined to 3 rooms in the upper tower: a bedroom, a small sitting room, and a prayer chamber. Doorways were sealed with bricks, windows barred and shuttered, leaving her isolated in near-complete darkness. Contemporary accounts describe Elizabeth's reaction as a mixture of rage and disbelief. She believed her noble blood would shield her from such a fate. At first, she raged against her guards, threatening dire consequences once freed. But as months turned into years, defiance faded, replaced by madness. Guards reported hearing her talk for hours, sometimes arguing with invisible voices, sometimes reciting strange incantations. She claimed to see the ghosts of her victims, describing their faces in vivid detail. The irony was bitter. The woman who had ended hundreds of lives in a desperate bid to preserve her youth was now trapped to age and wither unseen. The vanity that had fueled her murderous rampage was punished in the cruelest way possible. Elizabeth Bathory remained imprisoned like this for nearly 4 years. From 1611 until her death in 1614, her isolation deepened, and she retreated into a world of delusions. Guards who brought her food said she often failed to recognize them, sometimes calling them by the names of long-dead servants or family members. She spent hours staring into a small mirror, the only possession she was allowed, watching the cruel effects of time and confinement on her face. Her health deteriorated rapidly, the lack of sunlight, exercise, and proper food stripping away the luxury and vitality she had once known. Her famous beauty faded, replaced by the haggard appearance of a woman who had lost all hope. But perhaps the cruelest punishment was the silence. The woman who once controlled dozens of servants, who held life and death over hundreds, was left with only the echoes of her own voice and the distant footsteps of jailers. On August 21st, 1614, guards found Elizabeth dead in her bed. She was 54 years old. Reports said she died peacefully in her sleep, a mercy she had never extended to her victims. The official cause of death was natural causes. Though some suspected suicide, there were no signs of violence or poisoning. After years of trying to cheat death by spilling innocent blood, Elizabeth Bathory had finally faced the inevitable. But her story did not end with her death. The horrors she committed quickly transcended history, entering legend and myth. Authorities carefully managed her funeral, Her body was first buried in a local church, but residents complained, believing her presence desecrated the holy ground. She was moved to a family crypt, her grave left unmarked to avoid becoming a dark shrine. The castle was abandoned, shunned by locals who claimed it was haunted by the spirits of Elizabeth's victims. Over centuries, it crumbled into ruin, yet, even today, visitors report strange noises and unexplained phenomena within its walls. Elizabeth Bathory's legend grew far beyond facts. Tales of bathing in the blood of over 650 victims of demonic pacts and grand-scale black magic took hold. She became the archetype of the female vampire in popular culture, a beautiful, deadly predator feeding on innocent blood. Her crimes echoed through centuries, haunting history and imagination alike. Elizabeth Bathory's story is one where history and myth have long been tangled together. The real woman, a troubled soul marked by vanity and cruelty, was transformed over time into a figure of pure, almost supernatural evil. Modern historians strive to separate fact from fiction, but this task is far from easy. Many original documents have been lost, and contemporary accounts often exaggerated her crimes for shock and sensationalism. What remains certain is that Elizabeth killed dozens, perhaps over 100 young women, driven by a twisted belief that bathing in their blood would preserve her youth. To truly understand Elizabeth Bathory, we must look beyond the lurid tales of torture and death. Her story is not simply one of individual madness, but a harsh reflection of the corrupting power of absolute authority. She lived in a world where the lives of common people held little value, where nobles could commit crimes with impunity as long as their victims were from the lower classes. The feudal system gave Elizabeth's power over hundreds, yet shielded her from consequences. For most of her brutal career, no one dared question her actions. No oversight restrained her cruelty. Psychologically, Elizabeth's profile fits what we now recognize as severe personality disorders, psychopathy marked by an utter lack of empathy, an insatiable need for control and grandiosity. These traits, already dangerous, were made worse by her privileged position and the absence of accountability. Moreover, her family history reveals a pattern of mental instability, likely worsened by inbreeding common among European nobility. At the time, the Bathory lineage had a known record of violent and erratic behavior. Elizabeth's crimes, though extreme, were not without precedent. Superstition also played a role. Elizabeth truly believed in the healing power of blood, belief rooted in the era's blurred line between medicine and magic. In the 17th century, many accepted that rituals could physically influence the body. What set Elizabeth apart was not her belief itself, but her readiness to kill for it. She had the power to seize victims, the isolation to hide her atrocities, and a mind twisted enough to enjoy the process. This deadly mix created one of history's most notorious serial killers. Yet, amid centuries of fascination with Elizabeth, one part of her story is often forgotten: the humanity of her victims. These were not mere shadows or statistics. They were real young women with hopes, dreams, and families who mourned their loss. Most were servant girls between 14 and 20, who came to the castle seeking work or skills to better their lives. Daughters of peasants, they stood vulnerable, at the mercy of their social superiors. Names like Honor torn apart by dogs cotter-burned with red-hot irons and polar-beaten to death survived in court records, a faint echo of their suffering. The noble victims, fewer but equally tragic, were sent to the castle by families. who trusted Elizabeth's status would protect their daughters. Instead, these young women were trapped in a nightmare with no escape. The trauma extended far beyond the victims. Survivors, families, and local communities lived in fear for generations. The very mention of the Bathory name was enough to make people cross themselves and whisper prayers for protection. Behind every monstrous tale lies the hidden pain of those who suffered to make the story possible. Elizabeth's crimes are not just distant relics of a cruel past. The forces that enabled her, the dangerous blend of unchecked power, social isolation, and untreated mental illness, still echo today. History repeats in the form of leaders who abuse their authority, religious figures who exploit faith, and wealthy elites who prey on the vulnerable. Power corrupts, and absolute power, as Elizabeth wielded over her servants, corrupts absolutely. Modern serial killers share many psychological traits with Elizabeth: a craving for control, a lack of empathy, and the ability to hide their dark deeds behind a normal facade. The main difference today is that few have the institutional protection Elizabeth enjoyed for so long. Complicity is another persistent theme. Elizabeth's horrors were only possible because of those who helped her accomplices, who obeyed orders, officials who turned blind eyes, and families who failed to act. This web of silence and cooperation sustained her reign of terror. Most importantly, Elizabeth's story warns us that evil is not always monstrous or supernatural. It often wears the mask of privilege, respectability, and civilization. The most dangerous monsters can be those we least suspect, the ones who seem to have everything, yet hunger endlessly for more. As we close this dark chapter, it's worth recalling the moment Elizabeth first saw her own blood on her skin and believed she had found the secret to eternal youth. That choice to value her own life above all others defined her tragic path. The great irony is clear. The woman who murdered hundreds to escape aging died prematurely, alone and forgotten. Her beauty vanished, replaced by horror and infamy. But perhaps the most unsettling part of her legacy is how it mirrors our own culture. In a world obsessed with youth, where billions are spent on beauty treatments, and social media pressures us to maintain perfect images, Elizabeth's motives feel less alien than they should. We may not bathe in blood, but we live in a society that prizes appearance over substance, youth over wisdom, and selfish desires over communal good. The seeds of Elizabeth's madness exist within all of us. What matters is whether we nurture them or resist them. Today, the ruins of Shakta's castle still stand, though crumbled by time. Tourists come, drawn by its grim history, but locals avoid it. They say that on certain nights, when the wind is just right, echoes of long-ago screams still drift through the air. But perhaps what we should truly listen for are the whispers of the living, the quiet warnings that tell us when our desires turn destructive, when our pursuit of happiness causes harm. Elizabeth Bathory stopped listening to those voices. The result was a tragedy that echoes through the centuries. In the end, the Blood Countess found a kind of immortality, not as a timeless beauty, but as a cautionary tale. Her story reflects the dangers of unchecked power, untreated mental illness, and the darkest corners of human nature. The blood has long dried, the screams faded, and Elizabeth has been gone for over 4 centuries. Yet the questions her life raises about vanity, power, and the value of human life remain painfully relevant today. By studying monsters like Elizabeth Bathory, we learn not only about the past, but about the eternal struggle within every human heart. The battle between our better angels and our darkest impulses, a fight that continues in every generation until the end of time.